Now, I spoke here in 2015 about war may return to this part of the world. A year later, I started my talk on geopolitics with a joke about Spikeman, Mahan, and Dugin. Now, I love dark humor, but I have gotten much more solace this year from yesterday's and today's talks about liberty, about the freedom to do something or the freedom from something, freedom to do your own thing, as it were. And this is fundamentally the reason I think Finland, in the end, sought to seek NATO membership. A desire to maintain, for future generations, a freedom from and strengthen security against those that would seek to restrict the liberty of Finns. Now, listening yesterday to Mark Shivsky, I was sure that modern-day Finns could appreciate the simple list of Athenian freedoms. Not living under tyranny, yes. Participation in society. You can largely live as you like, and not being a slave in the sense that economic or social background doesn't determine your future outcome or limit your potential. Now, Alexander Lee added to this, talking about Venice and the idea that you can make people better through education, more virtuous. And the idea that art could then be used to suggest that maybe there's a greater good to consider. Now, in Finland, education is held in high esteem. This is good to make better citizens, but also because in the end, those citizens will feel there's a reason for Finland to exist. I will return to this. But simply note that Mark, and then also later Chris Coker, spoke about Athens in a way that made it clear that despite hearing, I don't know how many times in the last 3-4 months, about Finland being the Sparta of the North, Athens is in fact a much better historical metaphor. Why? Because it was quite clear that the Athenians realized that freedom required collective sacrifices, and therefore liberties must be balanced. So without collective action, such as military action or military service, which obviously limits personal freedom, there can ultimately be no personal freedom. Now, it took the Finns and the Swedes a couple decades to decide on NATO membership after EU membership. The opinion in Finland has been against NATO membership. It's been remarkably stable. 60 to 70% have been against it, and 20 to 30% for it since the late 90s. Irrespective of what was happening around the world. Why? Well, there's a number of reasons, but I'll give you a few historical kind of signposts maybe. One starts with a frequently used quote. Every country has quotes that are used and misused for historical purposes. But the King's Gate, Suomenlinna fortress right outside of Helsinki, it says, "Stand here on your own 2 feet and do not expect or trust foreign assistance." Now, considering the fact that prior to the building of this fortress and after, Russia had attacked the Finnish people, depending on how you count, 30 to 40 times, and usually the Finns have been left to their own devices to fend for themselves. This was a fairly reasonable reminder, I think. Now, this idea of being left alone was strengthened during the Winter War against the Soviet Union. It's a little bit of a myth, of course, because Sweden graciously donated, for instance, about 1/3 of its air force, let about 7,000 to 8,000 volunteers come and fight on the Finnish side. But it is a national myth. Second one, a historical lesson, is there's a sense that Finland has been drawn into wars by the West, while a part of the Swedish Empire, and forced into wars by the East, Russia. And therefore, the historical lesson, avoid getting into or being a piece of great power competitions. NATO is still viewed by quite a number of people as a tool of great power competition. As a side note to those who like IR theory, there's an idea of entanglement. In Finland, that is, large countries being pulled into wars by smaller ones. In Finland, it's the reverse. Finns are deathly afraid that NATO membership will pull them into other wars they could avoid. Now, the Finnish population security view did change after 2014, and then it took another 8 years to decide NATO was the right thing. Why? Well, the aforementioned history, a concern of what Russia might do, a belief in our own robust national defense, and increased defense cooperation with Sweden, US, NATO, etc. Then, starting at the end of 2021, the population started to look at the world and say, which led to a shift in support for NATO from 25% in early 2022 to nearly 80% in May. That's an incredible shift. Now, as in any democracy appropriately, the political parties looked at this and said, we may have some work to do here. Now, why did this happen? Research in coming years will actually tell us, but I have some hypotheses. One, Russia's demand for a sphere of influence in December 2021. Russia's clear willingness to use actual large-scale military force. Proof that there was difference between being a partner, like Ukraine or Finland, or an ally, in terms of what kind of assistance and how much of it you could expect. Then a change in belief that if Finland kind of made itself seem unthreatening and had a reasonably functional relationship with Russia, that this would somehow protect it from attack. The Ukrainians probably also thought this. And then probably a reminder to some who do not get paid to think about this every day of what large-scale mechanized violence and war means to civilians, to soldiers, to cities. Now, there are quickly three other reasons the population changing in mind probably wasn't quite enough. One is a deep pragmatism. Every political leader in Finland said this is not about party politics. This is about maximizing Finnish security. Second one, we've already had a two-decade-long debate about NATO. It's just that the conclusion for 20 years was we don't need NATO. And this time the conclusion was we actually should seek NATO membership. And then finally, I guess something that I've maligned, a NATO option. This was important only because every party in parliament had agreed to the idea that if the security situation changes, Finland can reevaluate and seek NATO membership. Now, I thought it was important to say a few words about how the Finnish government motivated, in the end, why Finland needed NATO membership. Foreign Minister Pekka Haavisto expressed it, saying Russia's increased propensity to use military force, ability to quickly mass forces at a neighbor's border, and loose talk about nukes required Finland to have a stronger deterrence, including a nuclear component it could never build by itself and shouldn't, and the potential for collective defense efforts. NATO fits the bill. Finnish Defense Minister Antti Kaikkonen, I think, put it even more succinctly. Finnish NATO membership is about avoiding war, deterrence, and failing that, to never again have to fight alone. Seems like a fairly reasonable reason. Now, what kind of member is Finland going to be? Well, I don't think we're going to see a lot of limitations outside of the one imposed by the Constitution, that is, no nukes permanently. Now, I don't think anyone's proposing that Finland gets any nukes, but I don't think we're going to see other preset limitations in this. Finland and Sweden together will definitely strengthen the transatlantic relationship, and I think their approach will be what I would call Harmelian. That is, yes, focus on strengthening defense and deterrence, but leave the door open to dialogue for the day Russia, probably under a different regime, may be interested in this. Finland and Sweden will also, unlike most of the recent expansion rounds, provide actual military capabilities. Really, really strong ones. And of course, membership, because of geography, will allow NATO, us collectively, to replan not just the Baltic Sea or Arctic defense, but all of Northern Europe's defense can be reconceptualized. The big thing for Finland, though, and I suspect for Sweden, will be the need to change strategic culture, to go from a very, very strongly held sense of we alone to belonging to a collective defense family. I've written elsewhere about what all this may mean. This will take some years, but it will happen. Why? Because of Finnish pragmatism and a staunch love for the liberty, for the idea of liberty, both individual and national. I'll end with a historical reflection which may make this clearer than any longer analytical treatise. It's October 1939. The Winter War is still a month away. In a station from Vallila in Helsinki, there's a train heading towards Kuolemanjärvi, Death Lake. Aboard are about 2,900 soldiers from JR 11, 11th Infantry Regiment, composed of people from Kallio, Sörnäinen, and Vallila, legendary workers' districts. Now, many were politically left-leaning, with fathers who had fought on the red side of the Civil War, a particularly nasty civil war, the scars of which were still 2 decades later quite fresh in the mind. But nonetheless, even if their fathers had fought for a workers' paradise, what these men abhorred above all else was the idea that someone from the outside, Stalin, would come and tell them how Finnish society should be structured. They might have fought for each other in the foxholes, yes, but there was a collective sense that it mattered for Finland to survive, for Finland to exist. Progress and safety were quite intimately tied together here. That a limitation of personal freedom in form of national military service was necessary to ensure national liberty. Because there needed to be a Finland so there could be a Finnish political system that was free to make decisions about how society was structured, about having high-quality free education from daycare all the way through university, about having a good functioning healthcare system, all of these things. All the things that ultimately liberate the individual and allows them to flourish, irrespective of their social background. This required a free Finland, and therefore it was worth for these men to sacrifice personal liberty or life to ensure collective liberty. Thank you.
How does Finland view its fellow candidate Sweden? We've done it together, but there are certain differences, I think.
Yes, there are some differences, and I think
don't be too polite because you're in Sweden.
Well, part of it is driven how the Finnish population changed its mind, forcing the hand of the Finnish politicians, including the president, I may add, which then forced the hand of the Swedes. This led to some scheduling differences, but I would say there's a political culture difference in that the Finnish foreign ministers were charged with going through every NATO member country and saying, green light, red light, what is this? And countries such as Turkey told the Finnish president and foreign minister, absolutely green light for Finland, we'd love for you to come in. So it was a little bit of a surprise to us when that wasn't the case. I mean, politicians have for years talked about the importance of Finland and Sweden going in together. And I think it's symbolically important that that happens.
But Finland has prepared itself for much longer time than Sweden, where we had no NATO debate until February 2022.
Well, this probably has to do with the fact that security, as I was describing, is a pragmatic question usually in Finland. Not belonging to a NATO or military alliance. It was a question of looking at the positives and negatives, and until 6 months ago, there were more negatives. As opposed to my understanding of Sweden, at least some Swedish parties, is that this was much more ideological. And as everyone here knows, if you have to change part of your identity versus just making a pragmatic choice, one is easier than the other.
The experiences of war is different?
Yes, we've had them. Okay, Sweden has had them too.
Yeah.
As the Russians no doubt remind me.
You don't have to tell me that you've had them, but what does this mean, do you think, to prepare public opinion? I mean, many Finns remember their parents remember the war, the sacrifices.
Yes, it is a natural thing to do, to prepare for things. I've been asked, do the Finns prepare for World War III continuously? And I say, no. The societal preparations you take, whether or not it is civilian shelters or any number of other things, they help society to be more resilient, whether or not it's an industrial accident, nuclear accident, fall, storm, all these things. That, I think, is the key to understanding Finnish preparations. Having looked at how Finns responded to Ukraine, it is clear that the collective kind of near mythical history I mentioned is there. There's a sense that I may be a 25-year-old Finn, but in my family, there are people who can more closely identify with what Ukrainian civilians are going through, for instance.
Thank you.
Thank you.